I've always believed that the world is governed by legacy systems. Old code, written by people who have long since retired, holding together the infrastructure of things we take for granted. If you look closely at a banking app, a traffic grid, or even the way a crowded city block flows on a rainy Saturday, you can see the patches, the workarounds, the little compromises made to keep the system from crashing under the weight of too much reality. My name is Julian. I debug those systems for a living. It's quiet work, mostly done in the dark, and it teaches you to look for the tiny, inconsistent variables that don't fit the surrounding logic. That's probably why I noticed her before she even came near my table. Why? It was mid-October, the kind of wet, chilly Saturday that makes the windows of the foundry steam up with the warmth of 50 strangers trying to pretend they aren't lonely. The foundry was an old brass foundry turned K on the industrial edge of the city, high timber ceilings, exposed brick that constantly shed a fine red dust, and a perpetual smell of burnt espresso and wet wool. I had my corner table, the one near the defunct freight elevator shaft, where the draft was cold enough to keep people from lingering too long. I had a lukewarm Americano, my laptop open to 3,000 lines of legacy COBOL code, and a worn paperback about the history of timber framing that I'd been reading for 3 months. Then the brass bell above the heavy street door chimed, and the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it shifted. She came in fast. She wasn't wearing a raincoat, just a dark charcoal wool coat that looked older than she was, soaked through at the shoulders. Her hair was a dark, damp chestnut, clinging to her cheeks in thin, sharp lines. But it was her eyes that caught me, not because of their color, which I later realized was a quiet, mossy green, but because they were darting across the room with the frantic, calculating frequency of a radar searching for a place to hide. She didn't look like she belonged in the foundry. She looked like she belonged in a museum basement or an old library, where they don't let you touch the books without white cotton gloves. There was a faint smudge of zinc-white pigment on the side of her left thumb, and her fingers were long and thin, twitching slightly against the leather strap of her satchel. She saw the empty chair across from me. She saw the man who had entered the cafe 3 seconds after her, a tall, immaculate man in a tailored trench coat that looked too expensive for the rain. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the creaking floorboards in 4 long strides, pulled out the metal chair opposite mine, and sat down so hard the little ceramic cup of sugar cubes rattled against my saucer. Before I could shift my laptop or ask her if she'd mistaken me for someone else, she leaned across the small wooden table. The scent of rain, damp cedar, and the sharp, clean bite of turpentine hit me. She reached out her cold, damp fingers, closing over my left wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Please," she whispered, her voice low, ragged and tight with a desperation that didn't match the cozy warmth of the room. "Please, just pretend we've been dating for years. Just 5 minutes. I'll explain, I swear. Just don't let him see me alone." I looked at her hand on my wrist. I looked at the smudge of white paint on her thumb. Then I looked past her shoulder. The man in the expensive trench coat had stopped near the counter. He was shaking the rain off a black umbrella, his eyes sweeping the cafe with a slow, proprietary arrogance. He looked like the kind of person who collected things, not because he loved them, but because he liked knowing other people couldn't have them. His gaze was heading toward our corner. In my line of work, when a system encounters an unexpected exception, you have 2 choices. You can let the program crash, or you can write a temporary patch on the fly to keep the processor running. I closed my paperback timber framing book and reached for my coffee cup with my free hand. "You're late," I said, my voice carrying just enough to clear the low hum of the espresso machine behind us. "I was beginning to think you got stuck at the gallery." Her eyes widened slightly, a flash of startled relief crossing her face. She adjusted instantly, her grip on my wrist softening, her fingers sliding down to catch my palm. Her skin was freezing. The transit line was delayed, she said, her voice stabilizing as she adopted the rhythm I'd set. And the rain got heavier near the square. I'm sorry, Julian. She knew my name. Or rather, she'd read the small brass nameplate on my leather laptop sleeve that sat between us. She was observant. That was a good variable. Well, I said, leaning forward, matching her posture so we looked like two people who had spent 100 Saturdays exactly like this. You're here now. Your hands are freezing, Valerie. I'd read her name off the brass buckle of her satchel. 5 Thomas, Fine Art Conservation. The man in the trench coat had spotted us. His posture stiffened. The polite, handsome mask he wore slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something cold, sharp, and possessive underneath. 2. He walked toward our table, his leather soles clicking against the heart pine floorboards with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Valerie, he said as he reached the edge of our space. His voice was smooth, polished, and entirely devoid of warmth. I thought I saw your coat from the street. What a surprise to find you here in this part of town. He didn't look at me. He looked at her hand in mine, his jaw tightening just enough to make a small muscle twitch beneath his left ear. Valerie didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened against mine again, not with panic this time, but with a warning. Arthur, she said, her tone perfectly flat. It was the voice of someone dealing with an annoying piece of administrative paperwork that refused to go away. I'm busy. So I see, Arthur said. He finally condescended to look down at me. He took in my faded flannel shirt, my 5-year-old boots, and the lines of code on my screen. His eyes dismissed me. Before he even finished his breath, you didn't mention you were meeting anyone. Especially not someone local. You didn't ask, Valerie said, and we haven't checked in with each other about our personal schedules in 18 months, Arthur, since the judge signed the papers. Ah, the ex-husband. The possessive collector who didn't like his former possessions occupying tables with strangers, Arthur smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve his eyes. A minor detail, Valerie. The board at the Historical Society is still asking about the restoration timeline for the Garrick portrait. I tried. Calling your studio, but your assistant said you were out of pocket. I didn't realize your research took you to drafty coffee shops. This was the drama. He was trying to use her career, her livelihood, as a wedge to assert control in front of a stranger. He wanted her to feel small, to feel watched. I set my coffee cup down with a slow, deliberate click. The light is better here, I said. Arthur's eyes snapped back to me, his eyebrows rising in a look of polite amusement that was meant to be insulting. Excuse me. The light, I repeated, pointing a finger toward the tall, north-facing windows of the old foundry. For analyzing color temperature on late 19th century canvases. Wah. Wah. The yellow light in Valerie's studio can be deceptive when she's matching zinc white on a damaged primer. We usually come here on Saturdays, so she can look at the pigment under clean, natural light. Though, of course, you'd know that if you understood her methodology. The silence that followed was incredibly satisfying. Valerie let out a tiny, almost imperceptible breath that sounded like a laugh caught in the back of her throat. She looked at me, her moss-green eyes sparkling with a sudden, wicked amusement. Julian is very particular about my light sources, she said to Arthur, her voice dripping with an easy, comfortable affection that felt entirely real. He's been helping me build a digital spectral database for the Garrick project. We were actually just about to go over the density mapping. Arthur's face went slightly pale. He was a man used to being the smartest, most influential person in the room. To be corrected on his former wife's profession by a guy in a faded flannel shirt who looked like he spent his weekends fixing old engines was clearly not in his Saturday playbook. I didn't realize you had hired outside technical consultants, Valerie, Arthur said, his tone sharpening. The society's budget doesn't cover unauthorized contractors. He's not a contractor, Arthur, Valerie said softly, her eyes locked on mine with a warmth that made my collar feel suddenly tight. He's my partner. He does it because he cares about the work. And about me. She said it so simply. It was the perfect patch. The logic was clean, the integration seamless. Arthur stood there for 3 more seconds, his black umbrella dripping a small dark circle onto the floorboards between our chairs. He looked at our joined hands, then at my computer screen, and finally back at Valerie. The board expects the preliminary report by Thursday, Valerie, he said, his voice dropping into a register that was meant to be a threat. If the digital analysis isn't compliant with our standards, we may have to review the funding for the entire conservation wing. I'd hate to see your 10-year project get shelved because of unreliable assistance. He turned on his heel and walked away, his trench coat swirling behind him as he stepped back out into the cold, gray rain. We didn't move. We didn't let go of each other's hands until the brass bell above the door chimed again, signaling that the system had cleared the threat. Valerie let out a long, shuddering breath and slumped back into her metal chair. Her fingers finally slid away from mine, leaving a cold, empty space on my palm that felt surprisingly distinct. I am so sorry, she said, covering her face with both hands. Her voice was muffled, the polished confidence she displayed seconds ago completely gone. That was horrible. I shouldn't have dragged you into that. He's been following me for 3 weeks, ever since I took the Garrick contract. He thinks if he can prove I'm struggling with the restoration, he can convince the museum board to cancel my funding and give the collection to his gallery. I reached over and closed my laptop. The CO bull code could wait. It's fine, I said. The logic was sound, but your ex-husband has terrible timing, and his umbrella is dripping on the floor. Valerie looked up through her fingers. Her face was pale, but the corners of her mouth twitching into a real tired smile. You know about zinc white? I read a lot, I said, tapping the worn timber framing book on the table. And my cousin is an art appraiser in Boston. He talks about pigment degradation when he's had too many IPAs. It's mostly database work, which is my actual job. I'm Julian, by the way. Valerie, she said, though we both already knew that. She looked at my laptop. You're a software engineer. I fix things that are old and broken, I said. Mostly systems that people built 40 years ago and forgot how to maintain. It's not as elegant as restoring a 19th century portrait, but it keeps the lights on. Don't underestimate old systems, Valerie said, her eyes drifting to the window where the rain was still coming down in steady gray sheets. They're usually the only things built with enough integrity to survive the people who use them. She sat there for another half hour. She didn't leave. Instead, she ordered a tea, and I got another coffee, and we sat in that drafty corner of the foundry while she told me about the Garrick portrait. It was an oil-on canvas from 1884, painted by a local artist who had died young. It had been stored in a damp basement for 40 years before the Historical Society acquired it. The canvas was warped, the paint was flaking in microscopic sheets, and Arthur, who sat on the board of the society, was trying to force a quick, cheap restoration so he could display it in his commercial gallery for a high-profile winter auction. He wants it shiny, Valerie said, her fingers tracing a circle on the wooden table. He wants it to look like it was painted yesterday. But if you strip the original varnish too quickly, you lose the subtle depth of the shadows. The artist used walnut oil and very thin glazes. If you don't use the right solvent, it just dissolves. It becomes compost. 2 constraints, I said, setting my cup down. Speed versus integrity. The classic project manager's trap. Exactly. she said, looking at me with a level of focus that felt very different from the panic she'd had when she first sat down. He's trying to declare me non-compliant because I'm taking too long with the chemical tests. He has the board convinced that my methodology is outdated. Is it? It's precise, she said, her jaw setting with that stubborn, quiet pride I've seen in the best engineers. It's the only way to save the peace. But I don't have the data to prove it to them in a way they understand. They don't care about the chemistry. They care about charts, timelines, and digital verification. I looked at the rain on the glass. I looked at the red brick dust on the floorboards. I have some free time this evening, I said, and my apartment is 3 blocks from your studio. If you actually want to build that digital spectral database, I can write the parsing script in about 2 hours. Valerie stared at me. Her moss green eyes searched my face, looking for the catch, the fine print, the hidden variable. Why? She asked softly. You don't know me, Julian. You just saved me from a scene in a coffee shop. I don't like bad systems, I said, gathering my books and sliding my laptop into its leather sleeve. And I really don't like people who try to force a system crash to get their own way. Consider it an offline patch. She watched me for a long moment. Then she stood up, buttoning her damp wool coat. My studio is on 4th Street, she said. The old carriage house behind the pharmacy, the lock is stiff. I'm good with locks, I said. The walk to 4th Street was cold, the rain turning into a sleet-like slush that bounced off the pavement. Hey, said. We walked close together under my umbrella, our shoulders brushing occasionally through our heavy coats. There was no awkwardness, just a quiet, purposeful rhythm. We didn't talk much. The storm was too loud. But every time the wind threatened to rip the umbrella from my hand, Valerie would reach up and put her gloved hand over mine, helping me steady the frame. Her studio was exactly what I expected. It was a converted carriage house, tucked behind a brick pharmacy with a faded sign from the 1950 seconds. The air inside smelled of linseed oil, mineral spirits, dry paper, and the cold, damp stone of the foundation. A massive easel stood in the center of the room, under a bank of high skylights, covered by a gray linen sheet. Along the walls, wooden shelves were packed with glass jars of dry pigments, small vials of solvents, sable brushes laid out on linen towels, and stacks of old leather-bound inventory ledgers. It was a workspace designed by someone who valued process over appearance. The heating takes about an hour to kick in, Valerie said, shivering slightly as she hung her wet coat on a peg near the door. Underneath, she wore a simple, oversized gray wool sweater and dark denim jeans. She looked smaller, without the heavy coat, but her movements were still deliberate and precise. I have some tea or terrible instant coffee. Tea is fine, I said, setting my dry bag on a clean wooden workbench near the window. Show me the patient. Valerie walked to the large easel. With a slow, almost reverent motion, she lifted the linen sheet. The Garrick portrait was a striking piece of work. It was a 3/4 portrait of an elderly man sitting in a library, his hands resting on a leather-bound book. The light in the painting was dark, rich, and amber, reminiscent of Rembrandt, but the details of his face were rendered with a sharp, modern realism. But across the lower left corner, a pale, chalky cloud of moisture damage had turned the deep shadows into a dull, flat gray. The varnish has oxidized, Valerie explained, pointing to the damaged area with the tip of a dry brush, and the binder beneath it has begun to separate from the gesso primer. If I apply a standard solvent, the whole lower section could flake off. I need to use a specialized gel that holds the solvent in place, allowing it to work only on the surface layer. But the board thinks the gel is too slow. They want me to use a heat stripper. A heat stripper on a 140-year-old canvas, I muttered, leaning closer. That's like running a diagnostic test with a hammer. Exactly, she said, her voice tight with frustration. It would dry out the walnut oil binder and cause micro cracks across the entire surface within 5 years. The painting would be ruined, but Arthur would have his exhibition next month. And by the time the cracks appeared, he'd have already sold the gallery's inventory and blamed me for the latent environmental damage at the museum. Okay, I said, pulling out my laptop and a small USB-connected spectral scanner I used for verifying old system microfilms. Let's build the model. We need to map the paint thickness and the density of the oxidized layer. If we can show them a 3D density profile, we can prove the heat stripper would cause structural failure. We worked for 4 hours. The studio was cold, our breath forming faint plumes of white in the dim light of the overhead halogen lamps, but neither of us noticed. Valerie guided the scanner with her steady, practiced hand, moving it millimeter by millimeter across the damaged section of the canvas. I sat at the workbench, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I wrote a Python script to translate the raw light reflection data into a high-resolution density map. We didn't talk about anything personal. We talked about pigment refraction, moisture absorption coefficients, and the structural integrity of old linen fiber. But there was a rhythm to it. Every time I needed her to hold the scanner at a specific angle, she moved before I even finished asking. Every time she needed me to recalibrate the sensor, I had the script updated before she could set the device down. At 9 o'clock, the script finally compiled without errors. A 3-dimensional wireframe model appeared on my screen. It was a beautiful, complex topography of the painting's surface, showing the fragile, paper-thin layer of paint suspended precariously over a pocket of moisture damage. In the center of the model, a red highlight showed where the tension was highest. "Look at that," I said, pointing to the screen. "The shear line is right here. If you apply heat to this section, the moisture trapped in the gesso will expand. The paint layer will literally pop off the canvas like a blister." Valerie leaned over my shoulder to look at the screen. Her hair brushed against my cheek, cold and smelling faintly of the autumn rain outside. She let out a soft, breathy whistle. "It's beautiful, Julian," she whispered. "I've been trying to explain this concept to the board for 3 months, and you just visualized it in an afternoon." "Data is just a story that hasn't been formatted correctly," I said, keeping my eyes on the screen to ignore the sudden, rapid thud of my heart against my ribs. "Now we have the format. Thank you," she said. She didn't move away. She stayed there, her hand resting on the back of my wooden chair, just inches from my shoulder. "Seriously, you didn't have to do this. It's a good system," I said, turning my head slightly to look at her. Her face was very close, her moss-green eyes dark and reflective in the glow of the laptop screen. "It deserves to be saved." "I should pay you," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You can pay me in terrible instant coffee," I said. "And a promise that you won't let Arthur win." She laughed. A real bright sound that seemed to chase the cold, musty air out of the corners of the old carriage house. "That's a very easy promise to keep." The next 3 days were a test of endurance. Arthur didn't wait for Thursday. On Tuesday morning, Valerie called me, her voice tight, with a controlled panic that I recognized instantly. "He moved the board meeting to this afternoon," she said over the static-heavy line. "He found out we were scanning the painting on Saturday. One of his assistants saw us leaving the foundry together with my gear. He's claiming I'm allowing unauthorized personnel to tamper with the paddock. He's calling for an emergency vote to strip my contract today." I was in the middle of a major database migration for a local hospital, but some systems are more critical than others. "What time is the meeting?" I asked, already typing a graceful exit script for my server connection. 2 o'clock, she said. "At the Historical Society's headquarters, the old library on 8th Street. I'll be there at 1:30, I said, with the data. When I arrived at the 8th Street Library, the rain had stopped, but the sky was a heavy, bruised gray that made the limestone building look cold and imposing. The interior was all dark mahogany, smelling of floor wax and old paper. Valerie was waiting for me in the vestibule. She was wearing a structured navy blazer, and her hair was pulled back into a neat professional knot, but she was pacing the marble floorboards with a nervous energy that showed in the tight grip of her hands on her leather portfolio. "He's already inside with the board," she whispered as I walked up. "He brought a senior restoration consultant from New York, some guy in a $5,000 suit who has never actually touched a spatula in his life." I handed her a heavy leather-bound folder I'd printed at my office that morning, along with a ruggedized tablet preloaded with our 3D interactive model. "This is our diagnostic report," I said. "It's clean, it's professional, and it's written in the exact language that board members use when they want to avoid a lawsuit. I checked the society's bylaws last night. They have a strict liability clause. If they approve a restoration method that causes documented physical damage to an accessioned artifact, the individual board members can be held personally liable for the loss of value." Valerie looked at the folder, then up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. "You found a liability exploit in their bylaws?" "Every system has a vulnerability," I said with a slight shrug. "You just have to know where to look. Let's go." The boardroom was located on the second floor, a massive room with a long oak table surrounded by 10 elderly board members who looked like they had been accessioned, along with the books. Arthur sat at the far end of the table, looking polished, confident, and entirely in control. Beside him was his New York consultant, a man who was busy adjusting a gold watch cuff with an air of supreme boredom. When Valerie and I entered, Arthur's face darkened, but he quickly recovered his smooth public relations smile. "Dr. Thomas," the board president, an elderly woman named Dr. Ainsley, said with a tired sigh, "we were just reviewing the emergency motion filed by Arthur regarding the security of the Garrick project. It's been brought to our attention that you've been allowing an undocumented technician to access the packet outside of approved hours." Arthur leaned forward, his hands clasped over a neat stack of papers. "We have to protect our investments, Dr. Ainsley. If Valerie is using unreliable, uncredentialed help, we cannot guarantee the safety of the collection. I have a proposal here from Mr. Vance's firm in New York. They can have the portrait restored and ready for display within 3 weeks using industry-standard thermal extraction methods. It's a clean, efficient solution." Valerie looked like she was about to speak, her fingers tightening on the edge of her portfolio. I stepped forward, setting my ruggedized tablet onto the center of the oak table with a firm, solid click. "The thermal extraction method will destroy the painting," I said. The room went completely still. Arthur's consultant looked up from his gold watch, his eyebrows knitting in a look of lazy annoyance. "And who, exactly, are you?" Arthur sneered, dropping his polite mask for a fraction of a second. "This is a private board session, young man. You have no standing here." "My name is Julian Vance," I said, using my full name for the first time in years because it sounded more substantial in a room full of mahogany. "I am an independent systems diagnostic engineer. I was brought in by Dr. Yar Thomas to conduct a digital structural analysis of the Garrick portrait's canvas and paint layers. And unlike Mr. Vance from New York, I actually have the data to support my claims." I tapped the tablet screen. The 3D wireframe model of the painting appeared on the large projection screen at the end of the room, spinning slowly to show the complex, fragile topography of the moisture damage. The red highlight of the shear line glowed like a warning beacon in the dim room. "What you are looking at is a high-resolution spectral density map of the Garrick canvas," I explained, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Our scans show that the moisture damage in the lower left quadrant has caused a 40% separation between the lead-based primer and the organic linen support. If you apply a thermal extraction method to this area, I tapped the screen and a simulation of the heat expansion played out, showing the virtual paint layer blister and disintegrate. The rapid expansion of trapped water vapor will cause an immediate, catastrophic shear failure. The paint will separate from the canvas in microscopic sheets. The board members leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of the simulation. "This is absurd," Arthur said, his voice rising an octave. "This is just a computer simulation. It's a stalling tactic designed by Dr. Thomas to cover up her slow progress." "It's not a simulation, Arthur," Valerie said, her voice rising now, clear, sharp, and filled with the absolute authority of a master of her craft. "It is a physical-chemical profile of the paddock. If you proceed with the thermal method, you will destroy the Garrick portrait within 72 hours. And according to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Society's Conservation Bylaws," she opened her folder and slid a copy of the highlighted document across the table to Dr. Ainsley. "Any board member who votes to approve a restoration method that has been formally warned against by a certified conservationist can be held personally liable for the financial loss of the asset. The Garrick is currently appraised at $400,000. Dr. Ainsley put on her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the highlighted lines of the bylaws. She looked at Arthur, then at the New York consultant, and finally at the spinning 3D model. On the screen, the New York consultant cleared his throat, suddenly looking very interested in his leather portfolio. "Well," he muttered, his voice losing its polished edge, "of course, if there is a documented moisture separation issue of that scale, we would have to conduct our own 3-week analysis before proceeding with any thermal application. We wouldn't want to risk liability." Arthur stared at his consultant, his face turning an ugly mottled red. "You said you could have it ready in 3 weeks. "Under normal conditions, Arthur," the consultant said, already closing his portfolio. "This is not a normal condition. The data is quite clear, Doctor." "Yeah?" Ainsley took off her glasses and looked at Valerie, a soft, rare smile appearing on her weathered face. "Thank you, Dr. Thomas," she said. "And thank you, Mr. Vance. It seems we owe you an apology for rushing this review. The emergency motion is denied. Dr. Thomas's conservation contract is confirmed, and she will be allowed to proceed with her chemical gel method at her own pace. The Society will also approve a temporary budget amendment to cover Mr. Vance's technical consultation fees." "I don't need a fee, Dr. Ainsley," I said, looking directly at Arthur, who was staring at his papers with a cold, impotent fury. "The data belongs to the museum, and the system is now functioning as intended." We left the library 20 minutes later. The sky had finally cleared, a thin, cold autumn sun cutting through the clouds and making the wet marble steps of the building sparkle like ice. Valerie walked beside me, her steps light, her portfolio tucked under her arm. She didn't say anything until we reached the bottom of the steps. Then she stopped, turned to face me, and let out a long, happy laugh that sounded like a bell in the quiet street. "You are a terrible, wonderful liar, Julian," she said, her moss-green eyes shining. "Julian Vance, systems diagnostic engineer. You sounded like you owned the library." "I just read the manual," I said, hands in my pockets. "Most people don't read the manual. It gives you a massive tactical advantage." She stepped closer, the cold autumn wind whipping a stray lock of hair across her face. She reached up and tucked it behind her ear, her eyes locked on mine with a focus that made the rest of the busy street disappear. "What about our other lie?" she asked softly. I paused. The system was approaching a transition state. The temporary patch had served its purpose. The threat was cleared, and the program was calling for a permanent resolution. "Which one?" "I asked the one where we've been dating for years," she said, her voice dropping to a warm, quiet register that felt entirely natural, entirely real. The one where we spend our Saturdays looking at pigment under clean, natural light at the foundry. I looked down at her hands. They weren't freezing today. They were tucked into the pockets of her neat blazer, but I could still see the faint, stubborn smudge of white paint on her left thumb. I think, I said slowly, that the logic for that system is highly robust. It just needs a few more iterations to make sure the integration is stable. A few more Saturdays, she suggested, her mouth curving into a beautiful, quiet smile. At least 100, I said. And I promised not to use a heat stripper on the process. Good, she said, reaching out and taking my arm, her fingers slipping through the crook of my elbow with a comfortable, natural familiarity that felt like it had been there for years. Let's go back to the studio. The heating should be working by now, and I think I actually have some real coffee. We walked down 4th Street together, matching each other's pace through the dry, fallen leaves. The sky above was a clean, sharp blue, and for the first time in years, the silence of the city didn't feel like an empty space between systems. It felt like the beginning of a very long, very stable program. We established our routine quickly. Some people think romance is about the high-stakes drama, the grand gestures, the tears in the rain, the sudden desperate confessions. But as a software developer, I know that real stability is built on the daily test cases, the small repetitive loops that compile without errors, day after day. Every Saturday morning, we met at the foundry. I'd have my corner table near the freight elevator, my laptop open, and my Americano cooling beside my keyboard. And at exactly 10:15, the brass bell above the door would chime, and Valerie would come in. She didn't rush anymore. She wore a green trench coat that matched her eyes, and she'd sit across from me, her satchel clattering against the metal chair legs, her hands smelling of lavender soap and solvent. There was no Arthur. The Historical Society had placed him on administrative leave following an audit of his gallery's acquisition records, a quiet investigation that had been triggered by an anonymous, highly detailed metadata analysis of his online catalog. I didn't tell Valerie that I'd spent 3 nights tracing the digital provenance of his gallery's collection, but she was a restorer. She knew how to recognize when an old varnish had been stripped away to reveal the truth underneath. The Garrick is stable, she said one morning, 3 weeks after the board meeting. She was holding a small glass vial of amber liquid up to the window light, her face lit by that soft, north-facing glow we'd lied about to Arthur. I applied the first layer of protective wax yesterday. The walnut oil glazes are perfectly preserved. You can see the old man's eyes now. He looks like he's about to tell you a secret he's kept for 50 years. What's the secret? I asked, my fingers resting on my keyboard. He says that the best things are always the ones that take the longest to clean, she said, setting the vial down and looking at me with a soft, steady warmth. He says that if you rush the solvent, you just end up with an empty canvas. He sounds like a very wise painting, I said. He's an antique, she smiled. We respect antiques. She reached across the small wooden table, her long, thin fingers sliding over my wrist, her thumb resting on the pulse point of my palm. Her skin was warm this time. The cold rain had stopped weeks ago, replaced by the crisp, dry chill of late November. But inside the cafe, the steam from the espresso machine felt like a protective barrier against the rest of the world. Julian, she said. Yeah? Are we still pretending? I closed my laptop. I didn't look at the 3,000 lines of legacy code. I didn't look at the timber framing book. I just looked at her. At the tiny smudge of Prussian blue pigment that had appeared near her left temple, and the quiet, unshakable safety of her hand in mine. No, I said. The patch has been fully integrated into the main branch. There's no more simulation, Valerie. She let out a soft, happy breath, her fingers closing around mine, with a strength that felt like a permanent anchor. Good, she whispered, because I was getting tired of the paperwork. We spent the afternoon in her studio. The heating was working now, a low, clanking hum from the old cast-iron radiator in the corner that filled the room with a dry, metallic warmth. The Garrick portrait stood on its easel, the deep amber shadows of the library glowing with a rich, historic depth that didn't need a gallery light to be understood. Valerie was working on a small damaged landscape from the same collection, using a microscopic scalpel to lift a tiny flake of oxidized varnish from a painted riverbank. I sat on the low wooden stool beside her, holding a magnifying lamp steady so she could see the division between the original paint and the modern repairs. Our breaths were quiet, matching the slow, rhythmic click of her scalpel against the old gesso. "You know," she said, without looking up from the lens, "my dean asked me yesterday if I was going to hire you for the next project, the Vance collection of early Dutch prints." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that your technical consulting fees were too high," she said, a wicked, quiet amusement in her voice, "but that you were highly compliant with my safety protocols, and that you had a very good eye for ground variables. Did he understand that?" "Not at all," she said, finally setting her scalpel down and turning her head to look at me. Her face was inches from mine, her green eyes dark and soft under the yellow light of the magnifying lamp. But he approved the budget anyway. He likes systems that don't crash. Everyone likes systems that don't crash. I reached up, my hand resting on her cheek, my thumb brushing away the tiny smudge of blue paint near her temple. Her skin was soft, warm, and smelling of the clean, dry wood of her workspace. She didn't pull back. She didn't hesitate. She leaned into my hand, her eyes closing as she pressed her forehead against my shoulder, her long, tired fingers catching the fabric of my flannel shirt with a quiet, unshakable trust.
"Thank you, Julian,"
she whispered into the warm wool. "For the light and for the patch." "Anytime, Valerie," I said, my chin resting on her soft, dark hair. "The system is secure." We stayed there in the quiet carriage house while the autumn sun faded behind the old brick buildings of 4th Street, turning the high skylights from blue to a deep dark violet. The street outside was cold, wet, and filled with people rushing toward their own complicated, fragile lives. But inside, beneath the old timber rafters and the smell of linseed oil, our small, quiet loop was running in perfect, beautiful harmony. And for the first time in my life, I knew that the system didn't need to be debugged anymore. It was already perfect.